Okay, I think we're live. This is our first one-on GFMA one-on-one interview, and I'm very happy to have a special guest as we kick this off. We're going to have regular interviews, which the most part I'll be doing, but also the other partners, David Reynolds and Fran Raybuck, will be doing interviews as well. But primarily, it'll be kind of my thing to do and pick some really good guests with some timely topics and things to talk about. So I'll give you an introduction just to who our first guest is. You can see him there on the screen. David Baxter, he's a freelance international development and PPP consultant, currently working as a senior advisor for the International Sustainable and Resilience Center in New Orleans. They're a collaborative organization of the UNECE, United Nations Economic Commission, for Europe's PPP Center of Excellence. He's also a steering committee member with WAP, the World Association for Public-Private Partnerships, which I'm a member of, and I do join David on the steering committee meetings. And between 2018 and 2021, David also worked as a part-time consultant for the World Bank. He still writes some really good blogs there, so that's something you want to check out. He's certainly a PPP and procurement capacity building is his specialty, but gets involved in infrastructure, consulting services. He has over 40 international clients and business partners located in Africa, North and South Central America, Latin America, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. Many client projects were sponsored by development donor agencies, including USAID, the Millennium and Challenge Corporation, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, and the Dutch Foreign Ministry and the World Bank Group. So David has a tremendous experience. He's a renowned expert and a consultant in the public-private partnerships and other areas. So happy to have him join us. And with that, David, welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion.
So that was just a brief intro, and I was going to finish off with saying David's always never boring, always engaging, the illustrious David Baxter. But everybody knows that. Those that know you know that you've got a great experience, and happy to share that as well. I think that's just another key element. Is it's one thing to have all this experience, but you're very good at sharing with people and encouraging people to motivate things and develop knowledge and share experience. So maybe if you want to just in the last sort of in your last couple of years, you've got lots of experience, just kind of your focus, and then we can go into some of the recent travels and projects you worked on.
Okay. Well, thank you for this opportunity. So I sort of came into PPPs by accident in a way when many years ago I was working in the oil fields of the United States in what they call the OPEC states of the United States, so places like Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, etc., where I got involved in concession work, and that really then introduced me to the world of PPPs, because many of those oil and gas concessions are essentially, in a way, a concessionary public-private partnership agreement to extract natural resources. With that, I then started getting a little bit more involved in international work. That was always my desire. I think you can hear from my accent that I'm not from Minnesota, where I live. I am a South African originally, or I suppose always will be, living in the United States. But I then started working with organizations like the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which was focused on building infrastructure and running large procurements where they did it through grants. And the countries that I was involved in there were Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, Cabo Verde, we think Lesotho, Mozambique, Tanzania. So that gave me a real wide exposure to the international importance of infrastructure, that we don't just build it because we can, we build it because it's needed and it serves a purpose of giving water security, food security, enriching communities, creating jobs, etc. Essentially, after that, I then landed up being the director of the Institute for Public-Private Partnerships in Washington, D.C., and that was a real deep dive into PPPs. And then I left it about 9 years ago and worked with numerous organizations, such as Wayne said, the World Bank, primarily in Saudi Arabia. I do have a World Bank project at the moment where I'm helping with the reconstruction development initiatives in Ukraine, and I hope that that goes well, because that's critically necessary. I also am an advisor to the Asian Development Bank at the moment in Sri Lanka, helping improve their PPP enabling environment. And then in Saudi Arabia with the UNDP, with Riyadh municipality, in helping them develop a sustainable and resilient city And the focus there is creating resilient and sustainable public-private partnerships for the city so that they can focus on the next 20, 30 years and align themselves with the Vision 2030 program of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who wants to break their dependence on fossil fuels and diversify the community. And then one initiative that I'm involved in, which I'm particularly excited, is I'm leading a group for the United Nations Economic Commission in Europe, based in Geneva, on setting up standards and guidelines for off-grid or mini-grid, if you want to call it that, PPP projects. And in November, we'll have our big launch in Geneva of the standards. But that has been particularly an enlightening process and an enriching process for me, because the team I've worked in is an international team. They have been wonderful. And one thing somebody asked me years ago, what have you learned about PPPs? And it's always the mantra in my head, you never know enough. And every time I work on these initiatives, I learn new things. So that's where I am at this stage.
Yeah, no, it's great to hear you say. I mean, as much as you have the knowledge and depth of experience, and it's you're always learning, and it's always good to be sort of in that mindset as things change, and lots of certainly lots to be done. Amanda, you mentioned Ukraine. That will hopefully in the focus, and everybody's sort of looking optimistically in the next. As we move into what will be year 4 of the war that's going on there, there's a lot to be done. It sounds like they've already done sort of the planning for that, which is it's optimistic, but it's also very, very prudent to be ahead of it as a project. So not waiting until the dust settles, if you will, but also to sort of start preparing on some key strategic areas. Do you see that as being that from what I can, in my knowledge and experience, I mean, I wasn't around as the Second World War, but it was, other than that, as a reconstruction, that's probably got to rival anything that happened since World War II. So it seems to be that's an ominous task at hand.
So they say there are trillions of dollars of damage to infrastructure, not just in the Ukraine, but even in the occupied territories. And so what the government is doing, and where the World Bank's assisting them, is coming up with a process where they can prioritize projects and develop a pipeline. It's just going to be crazily impossible to do everything instantaneously, but they do need to have a program that's going to be sustainable, looks at pressing needs and addresses those. And I suppose, to use the cliche that everyone uses with PPPs, projects that are going to give the maximum value for money, but not just in the sense of commercial aspects or financial aspects, but also sort of the United Nations expanded vision of not just value for money, but also looking at value for people and value for the planet.
Like the key SDGs that would be applicable.
Yeah, and then developing projects that help identify the sustainable development goals of each country or achieve them. I think the time is past in the PPP world where we just build projects because engineers believe they can, or financiers believe they can finance them. It's really now a need because of limited international development budgets, the repositioning geopolitically of the world, and that projects need to really help the communities that they focused on. And it's very interesting as PPPs evolved over the years that right in the beginning, there seemed to be more a way of relieving the stress or the financial burden on governments, but not really focusing on the people. Now the focus is, swinging towards, is this project going to have a meaningful impact on people and vulnerable communities and the users, and can they afford it? And I suppose the question that seldom was asked in the past with many mega projects is, do people really want it and do they really need it?
Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of these projects, they just do it and get the political mileage out of it and the sort of opportunity at the time, and then they may be successful or not. Another thing in PPPs too, they had, depends on what areas, but I remember in Canada too, they always, a part of that was the sort of community benefits. So whatever they do, obviously that would be specific to the project. It could vary, but certainly something that there was some value there as well. It wasn't just on the basis of the merits of the project in and of itself, like infrastructure, whatever it might have been. Do you still see that or that's probably more in integrated into that sort of that model that they, like you said, it's more the social and community benefits, not just, whatever you need, maybe water treatment plant, which obviously benefits the people, the consumers. But aside from that, maybe where they're building, the impact it'll have on the environment or locally because of this project.
So I think, the word that I'm glad you brought it up, locally, is in many instances, projects have been, how would you call it, decided by a central government, and it's sort of national, but often doesn't address the needs of local communities. And with that, there's also an increased now a focus on small-scale PPPs or PPPs at municipal level. WAP, the World Association of PPP Professionals, PPP units and professionals, both of which you and Wayne and I are members of, has had a year where they have focused on small-scale PPPs and municipal level PPPs. And, these are critically important because the small scale is often not attractive to large investors. In very large projects, often local providers or construction companies are excluded because they don't have the expertise, knowledge, know-how, ability, however you wish to describe it. With small-scale PPPs, there's definitely a focus on the local context, on local, partners, creating opportunities for local businesses. And I think that will change, a lot of the emphasis or the focus on where PPPs have been in the last few years. Yet there will always be mega projects because they just are needed. But the small-scale municipal PPP projects are critical. And that's especially, for example, where I'm working in Saudi Arabia. These are all going to be municipal level PPP projects. So, for example, the central government has the National Center for Privatization and PPPs, NCP, in Saudi Arabia. But they are very focused on extremely large projects. And yet the municipality has its needs and its specific types of projects, and they've needed to craft specific small-scale projects that are going to be attractive to investors. Scale is a critically important element because, for example, and I always remind people that a large-scale project in, say, let's say Uganda, for example, which is $20–30 million, is piffle in the United States, where they can build a $20 billion PPP project. You just think of what they've been doing, for example, how much it costs per mile in the New York City's metro upgrades. I think it's like $2 to $3 billion a mile. And so, that would be the national budget for maybe a year or two or three in small countries.
It's a head scratcher. You question the economic viability of such high numbers per unit cost, but anyway.
So we have to be aware of that context also, mega versus local versus, what is large. And I think the one thing that has been critically important to understand is to attract investors' interest in smaller scale PPPs is the idea of bundling projects. So not just building one little local school, but building 6 or 7. So it's worth the transactional cost in that, because the transactional cost for a small project, alarmingly, with the lawyer's fees and the analysis and everything it's done, could be almost as large as for a project.
It's disproportionate to the cost, the value of the project.
Yeah.
Before you continue, I just say I'm remiss. I should have said just in the Q&A there, any questions that people have, we can grab them. There's none yet, but we'll post them on the screen. Anybody has, we have a long list of things we can talk about and different questions, but certainly happy to sort of solicit that input from our audience. And we'll answer those. I was just going to say, there's probably no stats on that, David, because it's relatively, I wouldn't say a new focus. It's always probably been there, but it's probably come to the forefront a little more now. With small scale PPPs, I would think there's a good number of this, not so much the aggregate value, but certainly the number of projects that could be successfully initiated and implemented and obviously executed. There'd still be compared to, the large scale ones you hear about, which are obviously the big ticket, the real big things, which the cycle is longer too. It takes time to obviously get everybody together and then finally get it multi-year. It's usually a bigger project. It's we know locally here, the Eglinton Crosstown Rail project, they go longer than was planned as far as, the timeline to get things delivered. And there's various reasons too in the US. And I'm not just picking on rail, but some of the other things, hospitals, that for whatever reasons, there's delays, but small scale, and maybe they're more nimble and you can certainly be a little more, a little more on top of things to address those. Do you see that being certainly a good? I would think there'd be a good demand for that as far as the number of projects compared to what's out there on the large scale.
Yeah. So I think the big challenge with billion-dollar or hundreds of million-dollar PPP projects, so much due diligence has to be done, and feasibilities have to be studies have to be done. And often, the impacts of feasibility studies have to be understood, the risks ascertained, etc. And, because of the high level of investment and the high level of risk, very, very complicated and detailed feasibility studies are necessary. And that takes a lot of time. Many of my clients have, come to me with their hair standing on end saying that their political leadership has said, we want you to initiate this PPP project, we want to have it running in 6 months or whatever. And unfortunately, often with a caveat, because there's an election coming up and I want to look good. And, to do a comprehensive feasibility study can take months on end just on its own. But with small scale projects, and, in WAP, there was a discussion about that as well, is do we really need to do a comprehensive feasibility study for a street lighting project? What is the environmental impact going to be of putting light poles in the ground with LED lights? And so in that sense, I think with the small scale projects, you can streamline the process. You don't have to be tied down with so much red tape and take up tremendous amount of effort to initiate them. But also, I think what's particularly important with small scale projects is that their impacts are immediate. If you think of it, you're going to build a mega project that's going to build a dam and a hydroelectric scheme and a grid that's connected to the national grid, and that can take years. But if you build a street lighting process, or you build a series of bus stops which improve the modality and access to public transport, those are tangible, seeable, and very quickly implemented impacts. And I think that's why a lot of these small-scale PPPs are getting more attention, and they are developed at community level. And so, we talk about public-private partnerships between the public and the private sector, but there are people also talking about adding also another P, and sort of like the people first PPPs, or private people partnerships, where you consult with the community and get their buy-in. And we often should not discount community knowledge and insights into specific needs, because who wants the scenario of a nightmare of building a project that no one wants it or doesn't use it?
Yeah. No, good points, David. Do you see that? I mean, it's hard to, and when you mention delays, some of that is in the inner workings of the system. It somehow gets in there that those that are opposed, they sort of fight that by virtue of pushing it out and subsequent delays. And I'm sure that's been the case on various projects where they don't want it to happen, so they just bog it down in red tape, and hence delay, and eventually it becomes. And of course, over time, the costs do go up anyway, because if and it's trying to, I guess, get opposition to a groundswell support to swing it the other way. But sometimes it's if it's viable, and like even the smaller scale PPP, it's part of a master plan or project where it would be built up of smaller ones. I mean, part of that, those that would see that's part of the bigger dream, but it's still, if it's something that you would do anyway, irrespective of doing the other ones or not, it's still something you do. Whereas if you put that as part of a bigger project, then it's an all or nothing approach, right? So that's the other good side of that. That's I think that you get the more immediate benefit, like over a shorter time frame, instead of waiting to.
And I would add one thing, and I thought you brought that up, was the idea of ancillary projects. No project is done in isolation to another. So if you're going to improve a bus transport route, it would be not a bad idea to consider a multimodal center, where you could add benefit or value to it. And so, in that sense, I think it's critically important that, like they're doing in Riyadh, for example, that they're building series of public parks, but they're not just going to build the public parks in isolation of one another. They're going to see how they can be interlinked with one another, so that it becomes a network of public parks all over the city. And I think that's where we can, put our thinking caps on and think about it and do it better.
Yeah, and another good benefit of that approach too is you get the small wins early, and you like a smaller project, get it successfully done, and then that becomes an example of what you want to do in the bigger vision for subsequent projects, or like I say, and sort of that would say here's the proven success. Where if it's a larger project, not only is it much time frame to get it implemented or like approved and sort of started, but then you've got this big master project that's going to take a long time before you even start to look at it, even the components. So breaking it up is probably a good idea. We have a question from Fran. I'll put it on the screen here. Can you provide a profile of what the small scale PPP org looks like? The number of members, project size, time and money, industry? Good question.
Okay.
David, while we're on small PPPs.
It's always, difficult to characterize anything as sort of a template answer or an answer that fits all. But, I first of all think that, you need, there's two teams in a PPP project that are often forgotten. One is the public sector partner. They do need their management team or their contract management team or their oversight team to follow the project and make sure that the desired outcomes and deliverables are being met, that the project, and we can talk a little bit later about that, whether the project's being monitored and whether there is operational maintenance which is being implemented. So I would think at least on the government side there needs to be a dedicated project manager as well as a contracting officer, at least minimum. Yep. On the private sector side, depending on the project, obviously they do need to have a project manager. They will also need, depending on the different phases of the project, if it's let's say design, build, finance, operate, maintain type of project, that team is going to change over time. So you would have, at first a very, very heavy emphasis on the construction side, the company that's building it as the partner of the consortium. So it might be top heavy with engineers, construction managers, workers on site, etc. But once the project's built and it is up and running, it's operational, the team would change so that you'd still have hopefully the same project manager, because for the the private sector project manager, because continuity is important.
Yeah.
But you would have, the focus would change to people who are more specialized on maintenance and operations, monitoring the project internally, etc. And so, it's interesting, you'll have a larger team up front, from the public sector that shrinks down to one or two people who manage it. Then there's the interface with the private sector that when the project starts, if it involves construction, that it can involve hundreds of people, maybe even thousands of people. On small scale, obviously, it's more likely going to be a few hundred maximum. And then it would shrink down to the tens of people, the maintenance team, the operations team. And that's really important. And maybe that's where, Wayne, we can just talk a bit about finance. How would you call it, operations and maintenance.
Yeah, sure. Actually, before we get, I was just going to say on that note, because that's certainly close to where I've sort of working in the operations sense and the governance and all that stuff, which is it sort of then begs the question of that. I mean, even though you can sort of push this from the private sector, on the public sector side, and that's what you do in the trace capacity building too. I mean, they can have the funding, the approval, the private sector ready to go, but there's probably some impediment there with respect to, they don't have the people there, or is it, maybe you can just comment quickly on that just before we move on to operations.
Yeah. So that's critically important, because most times any institution does a PPP project, they've never done it before. It's really
around experience.
How many times, I can't say for certainty, but I would say 70% of PPP projects that are initiated by municipalities or institutions, local governments, etc., is their first, hopefully not their last, because it's a disaster, but their first, and maybe, as you said, a pilot study that's going to lead to, future projects. Right. And you have to plan and prepare the team. Now, typically, if you are having a competitive and transparent procurement and you're not giving it to friends, family, cronies, or whatever, you would hope that the public sector committee that is going to evaluate the bids is going to choose a company that has experience. Right. That's the thing that we're always looking for. Have you done it before? Have you done it successfully? Do you know what you're doing, etc.? Unfortunately, when you get to smaller scale municipal PPP, especially, in evolving, developing communities where they're going to be very small, which might be for 10 wells or
right.
a refrigeration plant for a farmer's co-op or something like that. There's going to be really no one who has that experience. And I think that's where it's typically or critically important that as the government institution that's implementing it trains its staff and prepares its staff for implementing a project, it's not a bad idea for them to do also capacity building with local businesses, etc., so that they really understand what the project entails and what the commitments are going to be. And then I think the other element is the risk allocation. Typically government doesn't want to think about the project. They want to sign it and forget about it for the next 20 years or 30 years.
Yeah.
And then when it's finished, come back and they say, okay, thank you, good job, go away. But, in the situation that it's critically important that these partnerships are strengthened, that the risks are allocated. And this is always a mantra which people say, and it sounds a bit boring, but it's critically important that the risk is allocated to the party that can best manage it. And so in municipal small scale projects in very remote areas, I think at times it might be necessary for the government to take more risk on than it would in a very large metropolitan area where they're very, very experienced companies. So there's no size fits all, but it's really important to understand your partners, understand the strengths and weaknesses of partners on both sides, and to find a way to mitigate it. And then one thing I did want to say also with the latest technology and software that's coming out, etc., it's making many of these how would you call it, monitoring activities, and that had used to be done manually and time consuming. Now they can be automated. And I think it will be explored is, for example, what role artificial intelligence can play, in being pre-warnings for risks that are emerging and, advice, mitigations, things like that. And hopefully not run by robots, but at least,
No, there has to be some human, they call it HITL, human in the loop intervention at key points, so it doesn't get too far away from you and you find it's totally flawed and there's some issues. Yeah.
But the bureaucracy doesn't need to be a pile of paperwork on an engineer's desk in an obscure office now. It can be digitized, ready and available to all parties. And that would, I think, dramatically improve the monitoring and operations of projects.
Good. Well, yeah, on that note, like you said, it's one thing to there's certainly a demand and need for these projects. You put together the plan, you get the approval, and certainly in the small scale PPP, maybe there's ways of accelerating that and expediting that, and it's making sure you have the right resources. But that can probably, like you say, the timeline is much less than when these things get announced, and then it's like 5 years later before they even start. And then, of course, the number, whatever it takes to put it into place, especially on a large scale project. But also that, like you as you've very highlighted in areas that certainly I get involved on the consulting side, is on the operations and maintenance and that's sort of the governance side. That's just as people forget about that because, once it's sort of kicked off and they get the photo opportunity and the time of this is great. We did that. It's launched, and I think, well, that's wonderful, and that's only part of it. But people realize a lot of the cost too is over the lifetime of that project. The life cycle is 80% of the cost, and how that's managed well, the operations and maintenance, and how the risk that's embedded in there. The risk is really throughout until you hand it over in 20 or 30 years before you say, yeah, it was successful. And there can be a lot of bumps in the road, and it's how you do that. And you're right, AI, and that will help, as to supplement sort of the tools in the tool chest for those managing it, because I think it helps to sort of optimize efficiency and certainly productivity. So if you try to do it even with systems and reporting and some automation, it's still AI would help maybe look at patterns and things of analyzing your data. Your data is key once that, and have people that are skilled that are dealing with, but it's a combination. It's not just a technology. It's not just the people. I think it's the right balance, the right mix of both. So on that, I mean, do you see, it sounds like there's not really a lot of awareness of that on the operations and maintenance side of things. It's more like, hey, it's a great project. Let's put it together. Let's get approval. And then, it's kind of, then you don't really much hear about it other than, yeah, I hear the shovel in the ground, we started, and, then it's going to be finished whenever. And, you don't really hear much about that, or even after that, or do you, David? I mean, what do you sort of see that as a...
So there's a story I always recite, which sounds unbelievable, but it's absolutely true. When I was working for a previous company, they had sort of engineers oversight over a large power plant project in Central America. And it was done, as a PPP, and it was excellent. It was doing well. The client, or they'd say the private sector partner had done it well, managed it well. Everyone was happy. They had the power they needed, etc. And one day in the government sector, a new engineer was hired, and they asked this engineer to, just look at the contracts and bring himself up to speed in that. Because they really, when you get newly hired in companies, often they don't quite know what to do with you. So let's give him the grunt work or the horrible work or whatever.
Yeah.
And so he did a review of the project and came up with an astounding discovery that the PPP project had ended 5 years before. No one knew, and they just continued with it. Now, in that case, they were lucky because the operator was doing a good job, and they most probably just kept their fingers crossed and thought, if we keep on doing a good job, no one's going to check up on us. And then, and we'll make bigger profits than we expected because we've covered all the construction costs, etc. And that placed them in a quandary, because the question was, and this is, I think, the biggest challenge, is what happens when the project ends, and do we as the public sector even want the project back? And I can tell you 99% of the time the answer is, hell no, we don't. We do not want it back. How are we going to extend it, or what are we going to do? And so the whole idea of facility management assessments, making sure that the system is running, that it's not running on a shoestring, but it's actually robust and resilient, is critically important. And so what I've been doing is, there's been a lot of focus on the design, the planning, the procurement, etc., and the financing. And then everyone sits back and says, mission accomplished. Well, that's not true. That's the first 3-4 years of maybe a 30-year project. And everyone's not thinking about the rest. So we do need to ramp that up, the operations and maintenance, monitoring, assessments. And I don't say, annual reports. I think that's too lax. It should be quarterly, or at least 6 monthly, so that if something's happening, we need to change. We also need to change the culture of the institutions, that when a problem is identified, that the private sector partner is incentivized to report it and not penalized for reporting it. Because often when you have that sort of cultural approach, that results in them brushing it under the carpet and hoping that it doesn't escalate and become a problem. The other, which is strange, and I've pointed this out a number of times, that if a company is performing incredibly well, and this does happen, for the skeptics out there are projects that do perform very well, and the company lands up making more profit, for example, the private sector, because it's efficient, it's doing the project well. Often then there's a group in the government that wants to grab that profit back, and they're saying they're being exploited, and that when actually the government, the private sector is doing what they're supposed to do.
They manage the risk.
And so if the project's doing what it's supposed to do, and it's making more money for them than expected, because they're doing their job well and they've mitigated the risks, that is the last time you should actually then make a demand as a government sector on bigger share of the profit. Because the result of that is that you'll just disincentivize the private sector to perform well, because
that's a very good point.
Why would I do it? And if we working 24/7 and we've got the project running smoothly and we're making money and we can meet our commitments, and the government's getting what it wanted, that's great. And the other thing that is unfortunately very neglected, and I've seen it in so many contracts, of what is the handback conditions, I
was just going to say that,
and how are you even prepared for handback? If it's a 30-year project, you don't do the handback 6 months before they end. This should be 2-3 years before that.
Yeah, because you're going to have things in year 30 that actually expire that on their capital renewal. So they say, hey, yeah, we're good till the end of year 30, and that's the end of it. I was going to interject jokingly. I said it sounds like that was the automated handover feature of the example you illustrate. But the fact, one of the things is, if it was 5 years before they realize, that actually says a lot about, you're right, the people that manage it, because they're obviously doing a great job, because 5 years after they would have had to deal with some capital renewals or something of a nature. But I guess economically it worked out well. But usually when you, like you said, that's a concern. You get to end of that project, there's things you got to be cognizant of and be prepared for, because they say if you don't have any option of, if you're taking it over and you plan for that, that's one thing, but there's things you have to do, and like you said, renewals and things of that nature, which are not, you have to plan for it. It's not 6 months, so.
Yeah, and what I'm seeing, it's happened now, but because of technology changing so much and technological obsolescence, which can happen so quickly, 2-3 years now, and something that was the state of the art is, antiquated, that people now considering putting in clauses that when the project's handed back after 20 or 30 years, the technology platforms that run it, or the machinery or whatever, needs to be in a better condition than it was when it was built. And that adds a whole lot of, added emphasis. It's not just maintaining it as it is, it's improving it constantly over time so that it's compatible with new systems. And I just think of like the federal government here in the United States, where they've spent 20, 30, $40 billion building computer systems for like the IRS and that. And it's failed, and they're still using 20, 30-year-old software and process because no effort was ever made to have anything stating that you have to do this on a regular basis, update, upgrade, etc. So, that is that whole aspect of technological obsolescence, I think, is to me almost now the biggest risk.
No, and that's a very good point. I mean, then it has to be factored, because it's for two parts, for the benefit of the bidder, in this case, the private sector, that has to plan for that. And there's a certain element of risk, because you're doing this at the beginning prior to the project starting. And then you have to look at, you have no idea what it's going to be like even in 10 years, 5 or 10 years, much less beyond that. And also the cost. Where is it in that sort of evolution of new technology? If it's at early days, it's not like there's something that's been proven for a few years. When your lifetime of your project ends, you can sort of adopt something earlier, but it's going to be costly. So you don't know. So you're going to price that risk in to some degree, because if you're responsible for doing that, and you're right, it has to be incentivized so they don't get penalized, because it's an unknown, and they don't want to sort of overprice it to sort of artificially inflate it to say, well, we don't know. It could be costly, depending when you do it and what it is, or how you implement that. And there's no criteria to base it on. But I think it's an important consideration. And that's probably another thing that hasn't been dealt with in the project themselves with government, is the handover. That's it's kind of like the forgotten area until I won't be around to worry about it. Those that are creating these projects, is let somebody else worry about it down the road. But it's a good point.
I was working in an Eastern European country a few years back. And if you think when communism ended, it ended about 89, 90, 91, 92. These countries were impoverished. Right. They just did not have the money. And they entered into a slew of PPP projects because they were desperate. And result was, last 5-6 years, many of these PPP projects, which were 30-year projects, have now matured and coming due. And so the current government PPP units or ministries of transportation or whoever the proponent is, are being flooded with projects that are being handed back to them, and they don't have the resources. They never thought it through. They didn't strategically plan for it. And I had a friend who worked for a PPP unit in an Eastern European country who just quit. He had 5 people in his PPP unit, and there was something like couple of hundred PPP projects that almost matured within 1 year, and they just couldn't manage it. The other thing I just wanted to add very quickly on technology, so many times in emerging economies, they are beguiled with promises of the state of art technology and the latest and greatest. The question often has to be asked, if it's a water treatment plant, or if it's a road, or if it's simple grid, do you need the latest and greatest, or do you need tried and tested and affordable technology?
Good point.
Because, again, that point you brought up about institutional capacity and training and that, you don't just train the people to manage the projects, you've also got to train the people to use the equipment and understand how it works and that. And that can become exorbitantly expensive to manage it.
Mm-hmm. No, good points, David. Yeah, it begs. Now we've talked about sort of the different facets of the PPP process and the stakeholders and obviously capacity and knowledge of those that are doing that. What about, like, and I get involved in standards, as you know, in the ISO for facilities management. I know people that get involved in the asset management, and that's evolved since 2018. The FM standards evolved, and we've really come a long way to providing that sort of guidance to the facility management profession. But really, there's nothing other than components of things you would pluck out as far as topical matters or subject matters, which may be key elements of a project, which you can say, oh, do that to best practice and have an ISO guidance. But I'm not aware, and I've kind of looked at that, and just what your insight is as far as any standard for like a PPP project sort of ISO standard, if we were look at promoting that or suggesting that. What are your thoughts? Because certainly people like yourself and others that could lend itself to saying, here's how you would do it. I know there's some guidance documents, but there's nothing really that's formulated with input like globally, like an ISO standards developed that would have that. I would think that would be something that would be much needed, and even for small scale PPPs to adopt that kind of guidance.
Yeah, no, I'm not. And it might be, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I'm not particularly aware of specific ISO standards or anything, because no one's ever really said to me, have you seen the ISO standards for...
You would know, I think, David, yeah. There's a PPP standard, yeah.
Included in a contract. However, an organization like UNEC, or the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, is developing a tremendous amount of standards, which, because it's the United Nations, they are voluntary, they're not enforced. But I think, so for example, the standards that we are developing at this current moment with the team for off-grid or mini-grid, PPP, sustainable, resilient off-grid PPP projects, there's that guidance there. It's also challenging because, if you think of Europe and the EU, where I think they almost killed through bureaucratic inertia because of excessive standards that define absolutely everything down to a minute level, and that you can't even, diverge from that or you get fined.
Well, they were overly prescriptive as opposed to being objective based. So that's where you get,
But you have a standard that's really practical, implementable. That's important. And, years ago, when my wife and I went on our very first trip to Europe, we ordered a glass of Coke, and it was interesting. On the inside of the rim of the glass, there was a line, and it said, whatever, this is where you have to fill the glass up to with Coke, because that's the standard. Do we need that type of thing? Because what happens if it's a millimeter below or a millimeter above, you're breaking the rule and you could be fined. And that's just, something that's just poured casually, versus that. So I don't think we want to go down the analogy of a glass which has a line etched into it stating this is what the standard tot is or filling is. But, standards, I think, play one important element, and that is, where we talk about strengthening enabling environments and we try and follow global best practices for PPPs. I think standards would be good as well, in that sense that companies that have operated in different countries, if there's an international standard and they apply that, then it's relevant no matter what, and they don't have to invent the game as they go along. They know what the standard is.
Yeah, it's pretty all encompassing. So you'd like you said, you'd have to break it down, because you'd probably break it down and have certain, like when they have certain series of standards, they have one specific to a type of industry or sector, because you wouldn't, to put it all in one would not be efficient. And even though the principle of what you want to achieve as far as that particular standard, like you say, PPPs, is admirable, you need something that's going to be specific, that's going to work in a certain situation.
And I think in the construction industry and that, where it's not PPP, but it's just, the typical EPC stuff and that, where those standards exist, apply those, because that is still necessary. It doesn't get negated because it's a PPP. And in actual fact, it should be emphasized during a PPP, because that ensures, sustainability, resilience, risk management, etc.
Yeah, I mean, you can sort of get around that, you can address that, I guess is a better way to describe it. You can address that by virtue of your contract, like your PPP, your master contract, where you would say, like you say on the construction side, specific to whatever region or and it's, let's say here in Canada, Red Seal certificate or something. So it's certified. Then you would look at different components. You can say, here's the best practice you must have, but that would have to be comprised as part of a document to flesh it out. And you could do the same on the O&M, like for the maintenance, and you could say, well, adopt the ISO 41000 series to make sure. So you could do that, but that would be it's kind of a monumental task that would be sort of in putting together under the contract, as opposed to just having, like I say, a PPP by virtue of its process, a separate standard. So good point.
And often, governments say, well, we're autonomous, we're sovereign, we don't need to apply these things. And that's fine if you're going to finance it internally with domestic investors and that. But as you start reaching out to, like the development banks like the World Bank or the International Finance Corporation or et cetera, and you go down the list, because it's on their terms and it's their risk that they're going to have to manage, they are going to insist that you start following their standards. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of bank-driven or institutional-driven standards which you really won't have a choice in, because then you're just not going to get the grant, or you're just not going to get the loan or whatever.
Yeah. Where do you see PPPs going, like in the next 5 years? I mean, you've been around this game for a long time, so you've kind of seen the history and they've been very actively engaged. Where do you see this going? I mean, you've mentioned some of the focus areas, so small PPPs, that should come up, and then some other areas, bigger projects, and there's certainly lots of work to be done. So I cannot see that sort of mandate, the PPP mandate in general, diminishing. But where do you see it going, David?
So, when PPP started in the 80s, and I was still a student then, so I missed that one. But when they started, it started in the UK, where the government just ran out of money and it needed financing from the private sector. And so it was a financial transaction, and it was just, we have a funding gap, we need money, how are we going to get it? We hate the private sector, but they're going to save us. And so let's, we'll form these unholy alliances with them. Now I think it's moving towards, greater sensitivity of understanding of sustainability and resilience. And that's a holistic approach. So it's not just about the finances anymore. So, where we talked about, for example, I mentioned very briefly that, everyone talks about value for money, but now this whole thing is pushing in of value for people and value for the planet. So it's not replacing value for money, but it's leveraging the concept of value for money. So, when value for money is, it's not just, are we getting the best deal for the money that we could have got, but are the people getting what they need? Are we saving the environment? Are we offering resilience in that sense? I think also what will happen is that as they, crack the code, if you can call it that, for finding ways to implement smaller scale PPPs, avoid, so maybe it's standardization. And I don't want to say standard contracts, because I hate those, because it's not just filling in the word. Every project is unique. Yeah,
it's not a boilerplate.
Boilerplate. But, as they improve that, they discover efficiencies and they develop practices. I think more smaller scale PPPs will be, let's call it affordable and bankable, because they won't kill all their profit in the the transaction cost in the first year, sort of thing. And the other is just, there's a need for it. They may 10 years time, they might not even be called PPPs, they may be called something else, but the concept of it is is going to be there. But tangible projects that deliver on tangible needs and that have very, very quick impacts to communities. And I think the other is coming up with projects that, no matter what the political slant is of a government, every election cycle, projects that will stand the test of political intervention.
And ideally they're agnostic and they're neutral from that sort of, and insulated from that sort of unfortunate undue influence if it changes the term, or even is certainly in the early stages of a project, if it can be canceled. I mean, that has happened in Toronto. That years ago there was a LRT project, and they'd spent a lot of money and taxpayer money, and just decided to change the government, and that kind of went by the wayside. So it's unfortunate when you see things like that happen. It's like wasted money, but I guess there was reasons behind it. Yeah.
And I think the aspect of stakeholder is widening. I would say in the 80s, a stakeholder was the public sector and the private sector partner. Then it became more other government agencies also became expanded internal, sort of stakeholders. And then there's, now stakeholders involve the community as well. But that's also a difficult area to manage, because stakeholders can often have groups that just don't really like PPPs. And no matter what it's about, they will always try, get it canceled or litigated out of existence in court, and then cause projects to fail. So when you engage with stakeholders, I think really finding stakeholders who understand the project, you've been educating them, you've helped them, see the benefits of it. And then the most important thing is keeping your promise. If it's going to deliver electricity, people get electricity, they're going to be happy. If it's promising to deliver water.
I think there was, there's here and again, time and again, sometimes you hear about how PPPs are flawed, and it's not really that good of a model or process. And that's really unfortunate and actually untrue, because it's not that the PPP model was flawed. It largely relates to the governance, and maybe they should have structured the contract better, but that doesn't mean the model itself is flawed with the way it's structured with the public-private partnership. It's just that the way the risk was, or the language in the agreement, and like you said, parties change and fight it, and then there's different viewpoints, and then they just want to change things, and they blame that arbitrarily, which without really, the real root cause of what the problem was, largely governance. But we still have time for a question. We have a controversial comment from Francis again. I'll bring it up. David, what do you think?
That is really an explosive, event that happened I think it was last week or the beginning of
just last week. Yeah, it's kind of
people screaming that it's, Soviet socialization, buying up, the state becoming a capitalist deal, and that.
Right.
I don't know. To me, I wouldn't see a government buying a share in a project as being a PPP partner. I just think they're buying shares in a company as such. I think the dangers, however, there are very large dangers when governments are shareholders or large shareholders in projects, is that they take the autonomy away from the managers to decide how they're going to do the project. Because, you just don't want that interference from a politically based decision on what's happening. And
exactly.
And the question would be, so the government's got 10% shares in Intel. What happens if they decide they're in a financial crisis and they need money, and then they suddenly, sell all their shares and flood the market, and then the share value drops,
Drops like a rock, yeah.
So,
Good point.
I'm not too excited about it.
No, I'm sure. Yeah, but it's a good question. It's just like, you never know what's sort of, and it's like, it was a proven model. Even I think going back, Canada is more now, and they've got the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which funds bigger projects, not funding from the government to do these, and they've been very successful in promoting and getting some of these things off the ground. It's one thing to have the money; it's another thing to be able to utilize it and leverage that mandate and get some things in place. And then, of course, all the other projects. I'm talking the larger scale, but it sounds like the smaller scale PPP projects is a high growth area with certainly much demand and need, which is great to see. It's sort of be encouraged, and hopefully there's more in that space. And I know with WAP, they've had some recent events and really good webinars on that to really focus and sort of share that information, create an awareness, and you've been part of that. So that's great to see, and something that probably will continue to be a key trend anyway, I would think.
And I think, especially with maybe small scale PPP projects, the equity, can be equity cost, if you can call it that, can be lowered, because if the government offers the land free or something like that, it lowers the overall cost of the project and makes it more bankable. But it shouldn't come at the cost of political connivance or say in the process. If you have a board of directors for a fairly sized project, I've often advised, governments that they don't force more than a 51% share or whatever you call it, and it's that they aren't the dominant shareholder.
Right.
I would say it even should be much lower, and that board members that the government appoints should not be political functionaries, but should be, if it's from a ministry of like transportation, it needs to be the director of, bridge building or whatever. And that it's really based on those sort of decisions and not on any political agenda, because
there's no bias in any form. Yeah, no, that's good, because you want to have credibility of the process and the model, and because those key changes can make a difference into success or failure, or certainly problems that sort of arise. Yeah.
If I can just say one statement, do project contracts evolve over time? Yes, because when we are looking at a project now, we don't know what's going to happen in 20 years or 30 years time, and it'll be foolhardy to stick to the absolute terms of a contract that was designed 20 years ago when it's totally irrelevant to what's happening now. So they can change and they can evolve, and that flexibility should be built into the contract, but it needs to be a mutually agreeable process, not that one party imposes the change on another, because that could upset the financial model so much. And so, if you're going to change the contract, you've then also got to look at the financial model, and you've got to look at the financing agreements and terms, etc. and that. And so there is a ripple effect. So, yeah, don't have a fossil, how would you call it, contract that kills your project, but don't use that as a backdoor just to change it. And I think the question there always is, if you change the contract, how do you protect the interests of both parties? It should not be biased in this side or interest of one party over the other.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, David. And there's some of these kind of like where they are now in coming up to, like you say, handover or even review or something. But that's something even if like for the existing, I mean, that's great for new contract, new projects, because they've got all these lessons learned and best, better today than they were even a few years ago. But what about a lot of those contracts that might still have a number of years ago, they're maybe halfway through the term or whatever? That can still likely be done, but it has to be by consensus, obviously, like you said, of the shareholders. Can you pick up, we still have a few minutes left, just of a project of there again, based on your expertise and knowledge. I won't cite any examples, I'll leave that to you, but certainly ones come to mind. You can pick the sector, transportation or whatever have you, where something was a good idea and it just, there was problems around to, then it got rejuvenated. And then, based on, like you said, setting things right and so what had to be done to do that. I mean, it's not the place you want to be in. It's nice to see things turn around, but ideally it starts and right through execution to the life of the project, you don't sort of have those problems or that major where it's canceled or almost canceled, and then it sits around for a few years. And your thoughts on that type of how that could be mitigated. Or, I mean, they bring people like yourself or experts in that know how to sort this out, but that's after the fact, and that's unfortunate. But if you kind of preempt that, it's always nice to be out of it.
So I think one of the examples that occurred is, especially in sort of in like Western Europe, and that is the whole idea of which you call cables for the internet and all of that, optic fiber cables and all of that. Enormous amounts of money was spent in laying these fiber cables,
right?
On that, and they're very static and kind of in a way limited. Now we have satellite technology, etc., and that can give you better and instantaneous, connectivity to the World Wide Web or whatever, through, just through a totally new technology. And the question then has to arise is, what do we do about a contract that's still got 25 years and the
remaining,
and that, it's just people are not going to use it anymore. So I think, there's a need to be aware that these events can happen. And it did happen, for example, if you think when you and I were in our 20s and that, there was no such thing as cell phones. Everyone had a landline, and enormous amounts of money were spent in building landlines.
Infrastructure.
And then in Africa, where I come from in Southern Africa, cell towers suddenly appeared and these landlines became obsolete. The contracts were obsolete. No one was using them anymore and that. And so there's got to be, I think, some sort of risk management of that aspect. And do you say in a contract that, if it's a a landline operator, can they now become a cell tower operator? Can it evolve in that way? So I think we've got to think in those aspects. But the government does need to, and I say this is, to me, is important, is understand that the context and the technology and the way projects are doing is changing. And don't cling to an obsolete technology because the contract says there's still another 20 or 30 years in it. I know a classic example. I think it was the Port of New Orleans, and I've mentioned this before, that in 1900, the Port Authority entered into agreement. It was around 1900 for coal bunkering facilities, and it was a 100-year, what you called, agreement.
Yeah.
And by the 1930s, only 20 plus years later, everyone was using bunker fuel. And so the Port of New Orleans had this agreement that it had built this jetty for offloading coal. They had to maintain it for a 100-year agreement for 70 years further. And there was no one was buying coal, but the agreement was there. So that company, which I'm sure didn't even exist anymore, really, was just raking in fees for years and years and years
for nothing. Yeah, and they didn't have the foresight to build that into the language of the agreement. To obsolescence was probably, that word doesn't even come up if you did a search of the contract.
Yeah, so. And the result of that was, when I was talking to one of the Port Authority folks, there, he said, "There's no ways that we will ever enter into a contract of that duration again."
No. What is that? Just before we finish off, where we've reached the hour, what is the usually it's 20 years is kind of the minimum and 30 the maximum? Is it kind of in that range still?
So it depends on countries. Like, in Sri Lanka, where I'm working now, they insist that they can't be more than 30 years. But I think basically it's based on the extreme cost of it, the financial model. Because I know, for example, in Norfolk, Virginia, when they built those new underground tunnels under the Chesapeake Bay and that, because of the incredible cost, those are 100-year PPPs. And it's just, there was no ways they could build it otherwise, because there was just no ways you're going to be able to raise the finance for it. So do we need those type of projects? Depends how desperately you need that and what the financial model states.
Yeah, what it is, yeah. Well, David, I know the hour went fast, but great to have you here, and great to sort of welcome you as part of our first broadcast of many. We'll have you back, many topics and things, and great to hear your insight and have you here. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay. Take care. Bye for now.
Bye.